Welcome to the Veritas podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex, and culture with an exciting lineup of international guests. I am your host, Dr. Petra Buskins, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies? Hi, Gigi. Welcome, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on your podcast, Petra. It's a pleasure to be here.
I thought I'd start with the professional spiel, and then maybe we could get into the personal.
Sure.
So, for those who don't know you, I'm sure most of my listeners do. You're a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales in the business school, I believe.
That's right. Yep.
And you have a BA in politics, ethics, and economics from Yale University, and a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. I wanted to ask you, because in my research for this interview, I discovered that you grew up in a household where your parents, as you said, cancelled each other's vote out because one was Republican and one was a Democrat. And then deep into another interview, you mentioned that your mum was a psychologist, which of course I thought was interesting. I thought, I bet she was the Democrat.
She was.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your background because it kind of primes you for heterodox thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been very lucky to have influences from multiple sides repeatedly, almost like a recurring pattern in my life. Whether it's, for example, my mother's and father's political opinions, but also their background in general. So my father comes from the South, from New Orleans and St. Louis, Missouri, and my mother's family goes way back in the North, and both of them can trace their history back before the American Civil War. So in expectation, men in my family fought on different sides of the Civil War, So that kind of reality, I guess, has made me very comfortable, I suppose, with speaking across aisles and considering views from multiple different perspectives. In high school, I hung out a lot with kind of misfits and people in the drama club. I wasn't very popular. So, people who were doing performing arts, which tended to be very kind of left-leaning, but also a lot of the people I would have conversations with about philosophy, ethics, politics, religion were actually the right-leaning conservative boys. I found their views very interesting, and I found them to be very thoughtful about what they believed, and so I enjoyed speaking with them, even though I didn't share all of their views. But I certainly was I was never really extreme, I guess, on any political matter. I sort of looked at what was going on, and my litmus test for whether to support something was always, do I think that on balance, this policy is good for people and society, right? I mean, it's not to sort of pursue a particular ideological aim per se in and of itself, right? It's just what's good for people. Let's go for that, right? And so there's kind of a practicality in there, which, by the way, I put down to my father, who was an engineer. And so the systems thinking, the ability to just get practical, pragmatic about stuff instead of just spinning stories on a whiteboard, which sometimes academics have been known to do. Get that from my dad.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I have that mix of a mum, a teacher, and a dad, an engineering draftsman. So I really understand that blend and the intercultural piece too, because I have grandfathers who fought on different sides of the wars, so as German and on the Allied side as well. So yeah, I hear you and share that. And it is interesting because it means you don't take a tribal perspective for granted. And I do think that positions you in some way where, well, I don't know, I won't speak for you, but you're never a full insider and you're never a full outsider. And that's something that I feel characterizes my background, and it sounds like it characterizes yours.
No, it's a very interesting way to put that. I mean, I definitely think also the profession of economics prepares you to never really be fully in anybody's corner. And I say this to my students a lot because economists are, what we're supposed to do is maximize social welfare as best we can through our policy advice and what we stand for. But maximizing social welfare inevitably means spreading the resources you have across multiple different line items, right, that you could potentially spend them on. And every person or every lobby group who is represented by a particular line item will want more than any kind of dispassionate social analysis will end up advising that they get. And so nobody is ever going to fully endorse from their particular perspective, your holistic advice, right?
Mm.
So, whatever you suggest, it'll be not enough because everybody always wants more. So from that standpoint, I always I tell my students to prepare to not be anybody's friend, but what you are is the friend of the whole. You are the friend, you're the voice for basically the voiceless mass, right? The whole collective of Australia, what is best for this country. And when we make policy, that's what we should be going for, even if there are screaming lobby groups, screaming individuals who are well connected who say, oh, but if you give more to me, then I will, right? And you have to dispassionately evaluate those claims. Is it true that if we give X amount more to that person, somehow everybody will be better off than if we were to distribute that amount, a little bit to that person and then some to this other thing and whatever? You always have to be thinking, what's the next best use of this dollar? And this is a very kind of cold and dispassionate way to think. A lot of people don't really think like that about policy. What they think is, well, what's the policy that would get me and my tribe, whatever that is, the most that we could get? And for me, my tribe is all of us. So I do understand the tribalism of a human, and the sort of natural inclination to want to have a side. But my side is humanity. That's it. That's what I'm barracking for. And so that's the lens through which I see policy. So if we were attacked by alien invaders, I would definitely not be thinking, well, let's see, what's the best for the aliens and for us? No. I'm human,
We
right?
have a human type. You're on team
Yeah,
human.
I'm on team human for sure. And that doesn't, by the way, that doesn't mean that you're kind of anti, the animals and the earth, because humans love the animals and the earth too. Look at all the things we do for them, right? We care about those things. Of course, we want to care for, Mother Earth and for the other creatures on this planet because we are part of that ecosystem and we have hearts. We love these things and we are nurtured by the earth and by often our companion animals too. So I often like to clarify that because some people think, well, that means that, you think that all, that nothing in nature is important or something. Not true. Humans value that. So anything humans value indirectly by the transitive property is valued in the policies that are best for humans.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because as someone who did political philosophy for years, it's the same as the social contract. In a way, it's the applied version of that everyone's partial. They come to the table, but the social contract is not about prioritizing any group and certainly not the most powerful.
Yep.
Which is why there was a reversal of the liberal social contract in COVID. I mean, that could be our segue in, but hang on, I want to hold you in family first. But I understand what you're saying. It's that sort of perspective that's abstract by definition, but it is on the side of everyone. And if you can think in those terms, it means that no group gets a greater stake than another. Or if they do, they have to be able to, there's got to be a case for it. And that evidential thinking is not the natural way to think, but it's an important way to think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was having this conversation just this morning with my husband about how the people I really have liked watching in the political space and have supported for political positions, leadership positions, are generally not the ones who have really, I mean, that I've liked the most, let's say, are not the ones who have actually ended up on top. Like, for example, Ron DeSantis in the US or JD Vance. I think that those people are incredible statesmen. I think they're very practical, particularly Ron DeSantis. I thought he just was, trying to take as much of that kind of perspective as I had seen in a political actor. And then he just completely got walloped in the primary. So people don't really respond to that. Like I was just trying to,
Yeah.
as what you're saying is true. I don't think a lot of other people evaluate politicians or leaders or potential leaders through that same lens. I think they look for, well, does this guy make me feel good when I listen to him? Do I like him? Do I like his voice? I mean, Ron DeSantis does have a bit of a squeaky voice. Fine. Okay. But, weird things that to me are like, well, who cares? If you think the guy is basically trying as much as possible to take that whole of society perspective, that, and is cool-headed and trying to be objective as much as possible. I mean, everybody's human, nobody's perfect, but, as much as possible, try to get to that and not be swayed by individual lobby groups that can just bend their ear and then get more of the pie for that reason. I think that that's a great leadership quality, and I think we should reward that. But that does not seem to be a view shared by, certainly the citizens of the U.S., I would say.
And particularly in the internet era, as much as I prefer the liberty that comes with many people having a platform, I do think we've lost something fundamental with the loss of the gatekeepers. I wouldn't want to, Pandora's out of the box, but it does mean that I think the tribalism is rising because everyone's in their own internet corner. So that sort of perspective that we used to have from mass society with the newspaper allowing the multiplicity of views, notwithstanding Chomsky's point, which was real too. But I do think we've lost that. So now it's kind of choose your own cult. And so we see that reflected in the leaders. Well, I mean, what do they call that? Audience capture. They're pandering to a particular audience.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say, I don't think that necessarily resuscitating gatekeepers is the way around that. I think,
No, I don't either.
but there is, I mean, for sure, there's been this rise of the echo chamber as the place where people get their news, and that has of course catalyzed even more polarization than we had previously, right? And there was
Yeah, that's right.
polarization already at the beginning of the century. So yeah, I think that's a space where we really need to be creative and
Mhm.
say often give ourselves permission to dream about a system that would create more balance in what the everyday citizen listens to,
Mm.
and just so that we can preserve some of that ability to be tolerant and understand that just having a different belief doesn't mean that somebody else is a weirdo conspiracy theorist, fringe neoliberal death cult warrior, right? I mean, we just have
Hang
this.
on, was that you in 2020?
Well, I was apparently the neoliberal Trump cannot death cult warrior. Yeah, apparently that was my name. But I mean, a lot of other things too. I was called a piece of human excrement. I was called a granny killer multiple times. I have a whole jar full of epithets. But I mean, for me, that is it's almost just a kind of entertaining, and I mean, of course, alarming to see that people would use those sorts of terms to describe someone whom I know quite well, and I know that she's not actually trying to kill grandmothers, and that she's not a neoliberal. I don't even really know what that means. So I never really those things never really sunk in to me. I didn't take them personally. It was more that I used them to diagnose that we had a serious social psychological problem during
Mm.
COVID.
Testament to your strength of character, Gigi, because I think that was precisely the fear that most people had, that they would be called those very names. And you were resilient in the face of that, which I find interesting
Well, I appreciate that. I people have said that
and
before.
wonderful.
I think I'm just missing some wiring or something. I think it goes way, way back to my childhood, actually. You wanted to get personal. One of the things that happened in my childhood, so I was never I went to an all girls school and kind of high income level school, but my parents were not really quite in that class, so they had to go into some debt to put me in that school. I was their only child. I was the love of my mother's life. They tried to conceive me for 5 years. And so, yeah, and when they finally had me, they were in their 40s. And then I was going to be a boy, the amniocentesis, I was going to be a boy. I was going to be Howard Franklin Foster. And then turned out I was a girl. And I was like 2 weeks late.
It's a presidential name, Gigi.
I know. Yeah. Well, it was my grandfather's, funnily enough. The two grandfathers on either side, the Howard from my mother and the Franklin from my dad.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm a normal girl.
Yeah.
But we had to redo all the testing, and my mother had always wanted a girl, so it was this incredible story. I mean, the whole birth story was just amazing, and so that it kind of set them on a track of just really investing in me and sacrificing a lot for me. So I think I owe a humongous debt to my parents for the upbringing that they provided. And one of the elements of that upbringing was going to the school, but I was never really in the in crowd because my dad didn't earn enough money, and I just wasn't in the right sort of social circles. Even though we tried, my mother put me in social dancing lessons and everything, but I was kind of just the nerd and the teacher's pet, and I was too kind of, I don't know, not as much like a girl, more like a young woman from a quite early age. And so basically, I learned, I think, as a defense mechanism, you'll understand this as a psychologist, I learned to deal with that social rejection by intellectualizing. And so I would, instead of taking personally the fact that I wasn't invited to the games or the parties or people hid my lunchbox or whatever it was, I instead was like, I wonder why they would do that. That's an odd thing. Well, what am I seeing in that behavior? What does that tell me about humans? And so that attitude that goes back way, way, way before my memories really started. I can't ever remember not having that sort of attitude when I encounter behavior from somebody that would often, cause other people to think, oh, they're rejecting me, or, that's really, not okay to say that about me. I don't have that reaction as much. It's much more, why would you say that? Um, Use it as input to try to understand more. So So I think that I have that to, as you know, to credit for my ability to kind of, go through this period of being called a lot of names and not have it really land.
Mm, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's really interesting. I would think of that as a defense mechanism. I would think that of that as a form of self-regulation. You have curiosity as a form of self-regulation, which leads to understanding. It's so
Yeah.
adaptive, but
Well,
it primes you for the capacity to resist the crowd.
well,
And
exactly. Resisting the
yeah,
crowd. And then also really, for an intellectual life. So I
yeah,
feel like it's in the
absolutely.
perfect position, right? I've managed. In fact, the Myers-Briggs said I was either going to be a performing arts manager or I was going to be a university professor, right? The Myers-Briggs, whatever inventory that you do when you're 14, what am I going to be when I grow up?
And
And
you're both with the
I am a little bit of both. I
yeah,
did do a lot of performing arts when I was a kid, and I do now do a lot of organization of events, public facing
yeah.
art.
Yeah,
So
and you speak well as well at events, and you have a kind of yeah, you have a presence, a stage presence.
yeah.
And in fact, when I was researching this, there was one video which I didn't get the time to look at, but it was titled Professor Eye Rolling. It was a Channel 7 thing, and then there were all these stills of you that I thought were hilarious, where you
Yeah.
were pulling these faces and they seemed theatrical. So that's interesting that you blend that. And I have a daughter who's very heavy into the performing arts and possibly sublimates to navigate group dynamics. And it does give you something, I think, very fundamental.
Mm.
So, and you grew up in Pittsburgh because when I went to the Brownstone, I remember talking with you about Pittsburgh, and you said, "Yeah, I grew up there because I went to the famous house by the architect. Oh, what was his name again?
Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. Frank
Brayshaw.
Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, the Falling Water House. So beautiful. It was wonderful actually. It was a good antidote because everyone just left the hotel. I'll stay a few days and wander around. But I had this big anticlimax when everyone left. They left all at once. Yeah. And then I was still in the hotel for 2 days. And then I thought, oh, I'll go and have a bit of a look around and the huge clock. And then I read the whole story, which was quite tragic about that family and how they, had boiling water and she'd suicided out there. What was the name of the family again?
Well, the architect was Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, yeah, but it was the family that he did it for, a Jewish family who brought
Oh,
in high fashion from Europe. But there
right.
was this meeting under Kaufman's clock. That was it. And
Oh, the
I
Kaufmans, yeah. Kaufman, when I was a girl, we used to go to the Kaufman's store, which was like a department store, sort of like um
that's right.
Meyer or something,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think they went out of business, after I was a girl. But yeah, I do remember that. And of course, Heinz Hall and the Bena, what's it called? Bena something center, which when I was a very young girl, the Benelux or Bena, whatever it's called, Benelong Center wasn't there yet. It was just Heinz. And of course, Heinz is the Heinz of ketchup, right? Tomato sauce. And even now, I only ever want to buy Heinz. We have a bit of a debate about this in my household, whether or not the Australian made ketchup is better than Heinz. And I cannot see how anything could be better than Heinz ketchup. Um, 57 varieties. So yeah, that and all of the sort of the Carnegie Museum and the Frick Park. There's a lot of Shenley Park. There's a lot of public goods that were financed by philanthropy. And,
Mm,
there's, of course, a dark side of philanthropy as well. And when we've, certainly known about that in the
yeah.
last 20 or 30 years. But at the time when I was a girl, I was very much a beneficiary of a lot of the investments that some of those initial philanthropists had made in Pittsburgh. And of course, the city was changing from a manufacturing hub because it used to be a steel town into more of a kind of redeveloped, regentrified, service-based and kind of office work-based, economy. And so I took my tap dance lessons in an old steel mill kind of, warehouse type thing on one of the shores of one of the rivers there. So there's basically it's 3 rivers, that come together in Pittsburgh.
Yep, I saw that because I ended up going around the town a bit and having a look,
Okay.
and they had this trolley car, like a tram that went up the
Yeah,
hill.
the plane
And
incline. Yeah, that's
yeah,
such a
yeah, that's
Mhm.
right. And yeah, it was very beautiful. So the conference was actually only 1 block from that Kaufman's department store. So
Okay.
I did go there. Okay, so that's where you grew up. So what brought you here? I'm assuming the job, but you seem to love Australia and you've stayed here.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah, no, my first husband brought me here. He was Australian. So
okay.
I did my PhD in Maryland, as you say, and that's very close to Washington, D.C. And so when I was there in my graduate career, having my kids, which is, by the way, the best thing for in terms of timing that I think you could ever do. I mean, based on my experience anyway, if you'd like to have kids, to have them in grad school because you'll never be
Mm.
as young, you'll never be as flexible in your schedule. And, it really worked out for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, we were there, and that was the 5-year period when we had the Washington sniper and the anthrax scare and the 9/11 attacks, and,
Yeah.
we were having our babies, and, we were like, "You know what? Do we really wanna be in this country? Maybe we should." And I always had wanted to live someplace other than the US anyway,
Mhm.
and so the obvious thing was Australia because, he had been born in Perth. And
Oh, okay.
so
Yep.
I thought, "Well, sure, why not?" And so I applied, and I only applied to places that, were in Australia, maybe a couple in California, but we were really hoping for Australia. And when it came time to go on the market, I had a, 2, 3-month-old, uh, exclusively breastfeeding daughter, and so I couldn't really do.
It was on, she was not, sorry to interrupt, but she was recently on the ASX. She did a talk based on her time at the university. Is that the same daughter?
Probably, I'm not
Okay.
su
Yeah.
yeah, Sienna is her name.
Yeah. Yeah. She did a talk for
Yeah.
ASF. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah, she would've. She
Yeah.
was a panelist on the Restoring the Presumption of Innocence conference that we did
Oh,
together with mothers of sons.
yeah.
And she may have also done something about she's just gone back to Europe now because she's just gotten engaged to be married, and they're gonna be married over there, long story. Anyway, but yeah, at the time, she was exclusively breastfeeding, so I didn't know what I would do with her if I were to do the flyouts, which are typical in academia. You fly out to a place that has a job opening, and you give a
Yeah.
seminar, and you meet with their staff. So I took a job over the phone, from the University of South Australia, and moved the whole family to Adelaide, not knowing kind of what a backwater Adelaide was compared to Washington, D.C. and New York City. I'd never been to Adelaide before, but I'd recently lived in those big cities. So it was certainly a bit of a shock to get there. But we raised the kids there for 6 years.
That's a
And
I mean, it's barely bigger than a provincial city, but it's very beautiful.
it
Wow.
was very nice. It was an idyllic childhood really for them because we
Oh,
had this wonderful house with 12 different fruit trees in the backyard, and, a traffic jam was that there was one other car on the road. It was just very easy to get around, and just, generally, nice place, and beautiful weather, obviously, and everything. So
in the 90s.
no, this was early 2000s.
Okay. Yep. Yep.
Early 2000s. So, and then eventually I kind of needed to advance in my career, and we were all feeling a little bit like there was, kind of a ceiling for the development of the kids, I guess. And we were just a bit kind of, I don't know, we were wanting the big city experience again, having been in the big cities with the mobility and the dynamism and all that. So I applied and took a job here at University of South Australia. So I've been here ever since. So
You
that was,
mean
yeah,
you mean University of New South Wales?
yep, that's right. Yeah, 2009, I think I started at UNSW.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I mean, I wouldn't wanna be in the US either, but all of that's coming everywhere, isn't it? So that's the other piece.
Absolutely true. Yeah.
Okay, so if we just redirect, because you were talking before about, love and I was thinking about your family and then that sort of heterodox perspective, and that seems to be central to your work is and I discovered through my research here in 2013, you wrote a book about love as a motivation for action. So I like this paradigm you've got around love and fear, and it reminds me, of course, of Matthias Desmet's mass formation thesis that I'd spent a lot more time. I hadn't actually read that piece of your work. I'd seen you on Q&A and loved it and understood you were an articulate dissident, but I now understand your paradigm a bit more and how you use it in relation to economics and so on. So if you could go into maybe your first book, which I understand that's The Great COVID Lockdown, this one.
No, that's actually my, oh gosh, I don't know, 4th book or so.
Sorry, what I mean is on COVID. Is
Yeah,
this
so it's
your
my 2nd book on
the
COVID, that one.
oh, that was the second one on COVID. Okay. So I'm interested in the cost benefit analysis that you did for the government.
Mhm.
And if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, because you made what is a very sensible point and seemed to be the way that most phenomena was dealt with before, that there's costs and there's benefits. And suddenly we're in a place where all we could talk about was benefits.
Yeah.
They were almost hyperbolic, and yet we couldn't talk about costs, and both at the time and then the imperceptible long-term costs. So can you talk about both your sort of thesis there, your methodology, and also the outcomes?
Sure. Well, I also need to give you some context. So basically, you're talking about 2020. So when the whole world kind of went mad, and we all sort of were sanity checking ourselves with our friends and co-authors and family and everything. I kept thinking during the middle of that year that sooner or later, hopefully sooner, everybody would wake up and realize that they had been just overly focusing on one thing, which was COVID, and forgetting about everything else that typically matters in normal times, and therefore causing a lot of collateral damage in their narrow focus on this one thing, which really wasn't that dangerous, and it was clear it wasn't that dangerous to people under 50 who were healthy,
Yeah.
even from that very early point, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I kept expecting that people would wake up, but they weren't. And very sort of sometime during that middle of the year, I was contacted by David Limbrick, who was senator, I want to say,
Yeah. Libertarian Party,
Libertarian
Victoria.
Party, yeah, down in Victoria. And he managed to arrange to get me an invitation to speak to the Victorian Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, which was the committee that sort of was, I guess, investigating what kind of policy should be taken, to combat COVID.
Mhm.
And of course, I accepted. I thought, okay, great. I can now talk to some people who are actually, making the policy and hopefully open their eyes a bit. And so I used that opportunity. This was in August of 2020 to
Mhm.
write up a kind of bare bones skeletal version of the book that you just showed on screen.
Yeah. This one. Do
Yeah,
yeah.
do lockdowns and border closures serve the greater good? So in August, it was just like a 4-page brief kind of review of what we would do, what we should be doing to evaluate a policy like lockdown. What are the categories of costs that it carries, and what are
Mhm.
the possible categories of benefit? Right. One of the categories of benefit, by the way, is that when you lock people down, you are obviously also locking down the young people who would otherwise be on the roads, driving like hoons or at pubs, and would occasionally, sometimes accidentally, off each other. And so you actually save a few young lives, not many, 100 or something, 150 a year, from not having them on the roads and not having them in pubs, right? So
Through
that
imprisonment.
included that, right? That was not a benefit on which we had been sold lockdowns as a policy, but that was something that was clearly happening.
Yeah.
And so, things like that, which were not really thought of, and other things that were not thought of, or at least were kind of, I don't know, they were maybe they occurred to people, but there was just this overwhelming force of the "we must save people from COVID" narrative that just
Mm.
squashed any real attention or any real elevation of those alternative, perspectives, like the fact that lockdowns make people unhappy.
Mhm. Mhm.
People don't like to be forced to be away from their friends and maybe their parents in the aged care home. Their parents have to die alone.
Mm.
Incredibly
Appalling.
inhumane, incredibly
Mm.
inhumane. Children being forced out of schools, all these things. Mental health basically declines during the
Yeah.
period of lockdown. And that's one of the huge costs, right? So there's that. Another huge cost is that you are basically pressing pause on the productive capacity of the economy. And so what is it that funds our hospitals? What is it that funds our schools? What is it that funds any of these things? It's the productivity of our country.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what ultimately, I mean, if you trace it back, where does the
Yeah.
money come from that the government uses? Well, it comes from the tax receipts. Where do the tax receipts come from? Well, because somebody earned money. How do they earn money? Because they contributed labor to the economy and they got a return for it because that labor was productive. So
Yes.
at the end of the day, you're basically saying, okay, guys, don't be productive for X number of months or years, and let's just wait this out, right? Well, what you're doing is sacrificing your ability to spend on
Mm.
everything that the government would normally spend on life.
Yeah.
Improves welfare. So whether you're talking about hospitals or, vaccines for COVID, if that's what you thought was the necessary thing, and whatever it was you thought you were going to need to spend on to promote health, you were basically just throwing it over the cliff. You're just sort of
Mm.
saying, oh, we don't care
Yeah.
about this.
Even undermining their own agenda.
Totally
Yeah. Yeah.
undermining
Yeah.
the own ability to pay for whatever it is that you thought, would actually improve people's lives. And so that just seemed to me completely counterintuitive, particularly considering that most of the working people were not really going to be that vulnerable to certainly to severe illness or death from COVID. And of course, we started learning
Because of
early
their
on.
age group or no comorbid conditions or
Exactly. So if they were
yeah. Yeah.
50, if they're working and they're under 50,
Yeah.
probably going to be okay, likely. And yes, of course, you always lose a few people to flu and a few other things every year. But that just the fact that you lose a few people doesn't mean that you shut the whole economy down. And we started learning very early on about things like vitamin D supplementation.
Mm.
Started hearing about ivermectin trials. We even
Mm.
had Trump talking about hydroxychloroquine, and then of course that all got twisted into people drinking bleach and all this sort of nonsense. But if you actually looked, and I did look at the time, you could find the individual courageous, coal-faced doctors who were trying different stuff, repurposed medicines to try to help their patients, and they were discovering things that had real promise. And
Mm.
what we should have been doing is
Mm.
A, tamping down the fear, and B, disseminating that frontier knowledge as it was coming in to our doctors and encouraging them to try to save their patients. Use
Well,
the
they were
word
throttled, weren't they?
smart.
Mm.
And instead, it was just like, nope, stay at home. Hopefully your lips don't turn blue. If they do, too bad. You'll have to go to the hospital. You may be ventilated, which is basically a death sentence in 90%.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
I
any
mean, it was
doctor who spoke up gets, like,
gets deregistered, right? I mean,
deregistered. Yeah, and worse. Yeah, charged.
unbelievable,
Yeah,
unbelievable. So
unbelievable.
anyway, I spoke to the PAC, the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee, and it was a 5 minute introductory speech, and then I answered some questions from them, which of course were things like, well, why do you have to have the right to have an opinion because you're not a medical specialist? I mean, they didn't say it quite that antagonistically, but that was the nature of the of one of the questions. And where's your evidence that this thing or that thing is really going to have that high of a cost? We are throwing money at mental health, so the whole, by implication, the whole mental health damage from lockdowns argument is kind of specious because we already are throwing lots of money at that. Which to me, that's just bizarre. It's like, oh yeah, we're
Really?
hurting the economy and we're
Yeah.
spending even more money that we now don't have to help people because of the hurt that we're doing. So ergo, the hurt doesn't count. I mean, it's just weird. Like if you think
Oh,
of
yeah, it's absolutely illogical. Yeah.
just weird. So anyway, that happened, and then I, of course, naively, even still at that point, thought that somehow after that conversation, the Victorian government would say, "Oh, thank you so much for enlightening us about, this standard bread and butter evaluation tool that we should have
Well,
been
that
using all
actually, can
along."
we pause on that for a minute?
Yeah.
Because pandemic policies up until that point, even, in the UN and the WHO and so on, my understanding is, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but that it was never to lock down the healthy. It was only ever to sequester or to quarantine those who were sick. So
Yes.
there's also, in addition to the just chronic lapses in logic that indicate groupthink and hysteria and so on, you've got a complete flip on what had been hitherto the standard policy
No,
for
exactly. So the
pandemic.
pandemic management plans that Victoria had in place and other states and other countries in the West had in place before mid-March 2020, even literally before mid-March, even early March, they had these plans, right? None of them said that locking down whole healthy populations was a viable public health strategy. There was no evidence that those kinds of policies worked, and there was huge evidence that they caused massive collateral damage. And I actually, after this whole thing, I mean, the last several years have been crazy, but one of the things that's come out of it is new research partnerships and sort of new tribes, I suppose you might say. And one of the people who emerged was my co-author on the Do Lockdowns and Border Closure Serve the Greater Good book, Sanjeev Sablock. He used
Mhm.
to work for the Victorian Treasury himself
Yeah,
and for
that's
the
right.
Department of
Yeah.
Ways. And he and I, so we produced that CBA out of those sort of early notes that I made in August. And
Mhm.
also, he and I and a few other co-authors have done some research, but he's done an amazing amount of it about the history of quarantine in public health for
I'd
many.
be interested to read that. Yeah, that's right,
Yeah,
because there's a history, and it
yeah,
was that precedent or that history was defied, wasn't it?
exactly. And even more curious or alarming or whatever you'd like to say, it was basically debunked as a public health strategy, quarantines or lockdowns of healthy people in the mid 1800s.
Yeah.
With the rise of the sanitarian movement, right? So the sanitarians came up and said, you know what? All this kind of weird stuff we've been doing, including quarantines, but a lot of other weird stuff too, to allegedly save lives is actually not working. What we really need is clean air, healthy food, clean
Yeah.
water,
Yeah.
and kind of healthy, hygienic living conditions. Not too clean, not ultra,
Yeah,
clean.
yeah, we still need our microbiome fed.
Exactly, but you don't
Yeah.
wanna have this huge amount of load of bugs, right, that the body
Mm,
just can't cope with, and you
mm,
also
mm.
need the terrain, the terrain theory of disease, you need the
Yes.
body itself to be supported, so the
Yeah.
good immune system, all that, which is good food, sleep,
Yeah.
and all that stuff.
Sunshine.
So,
Yeah.
they basically discovered that that was the way to promote population level health, and that was the moment in history when you see human longevity rising in the graphs.
Yes. Yes.
So, there's sort of some evidence that, yes, they were onto something, right?
Mm.
Uh, and yet we forgot. We forgot all about that, and we just marched along with this totally unproven policy. In the book that you just showed, Sanjeev and I had to assume, and even in my skeletal CBA that I presented to Victoria in August 2020, we had to assume that there was some benefit of lockdowns, but that was the one assumption in the entire book for which there was no empirical evidence. Right?
Oh, interesting.
We had to assume it because otherwise we would never have been taken seriously because
Yeah.
there's no, I mean, otherwise it's just a complete, I mean, it's already an open and shut case, but it would be like kangaroo court level open and shut if we just
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
well,
you would look biased, but I noticed that you
exactly.
say in the book that we were, generous with the benefits and highly conservative with the costs. Like you don't bring in the costs of vaccine injuries or the cost of, so you're really exclusively looking at lockdown. So if you add that to it and then, then it's
Enormous.
still a
No.
problem. But I mean, it's just massive. It's much bigger than even you estimated.
Oh, definitely. And what we
Which,
found in with our conservative estimates,
yeah.
biased against finding that lockdowns would be doing net damage, is that we find that the cost of the lockdowns were at least 68 times the size of the benefits.
Can you outline that a little bit? I mean, what are the things that come into that figure?
Well, the two biggest elements are the ones I've already mentioned. So one is the direct mental health damage and just well-being damage of
Mhm,
being locked down. So
mhm,
when you put a country into lockdown, you hurt people. You prevent them from doing what they would otherwise have preferred to do, right? And the fact that you don't see people behaving as if they're in lockdown when they're not tells you that they are happier to do what it is that they're choosing to do rather than be in lockdown. So you can immediately just infer as a scientist,
mhm.
yeah, this is going to cause damage. And even, I mean, people say, well, people would have stayed home anyway, even if we hadn't had the lockdowns. Well, maybe that's true. Some people might have, and that's fine, right? But then you're not forcing those who wouldn't have to stay home. And you can then target your policy much better. You can actually put the resources that you've got to treat any problem in society, including a health problem, towards the people who are actually at risk, which would have been
Yeah.
the elderly, the infirm, the comorbid. And so I went on radio actually in March 2020 saying exactly that we should lift the lockdowns on everybody and just target aggressively the elder people because they're the ones who we knew at that moment were more at risk of having serious problems or dying from this disease. Even they were likelier to survive than not, but there was a clear age gradient and they were the most vulnerable. So if we wanted to
And
do
can I
that,
just
we should have
interject there,
focused on
Gigi, and say we also, I mean, as someone who's become more classically liberal and butting up against libertarianism since this, I don't think we should impose, I mean, I'm not suggesting you're saying that, those policies on anyone,
oh,
actually. I
no,
think
no, we shouldn't have
it's
locked
egregious,
down anybody.
including old
No,
people.
no, no, no.
It's an
But
egregious
violation of human liberties. No, totally.
violation of liberties. Yeah.
But if you're thinking from the state's perspective, we want to do something about COVID, who is really at risk? Well, those are
Mm,
the people. So what do? You
yeah.
invest in things like studying the architecture of the aged care home, the ventilation system,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
requirements, and you put together, instruction guides for people
Yeah.
who are elderly, living alone, or
Yeah.
living
Yeah.
with a family. You
Yeah.
provide information, and
Mhm.
you focus that information provision on the people who really need it because
Yeah.
they're the
Yeah.
ones who are at risk, right? Obviously, this was what you do. So anyway, um, so that was the first thing is that, the major cost to human life satisfaction of being in lockdown, that costs about a third of the total cost of lockdowns.
Mhm, mhm.
And, you don't think it's like that much for one person who's locked down, but if you add it up for everybody who
Yeah,
ends
you
up
aggregate
locked
that
down,
across the population.
it's a large amount of human life satisfaction, human well-being that's being sacrificed. And, in my book, how I try to operationalize social welfare, which is the thing we're told we're supposed to maximize in economics, is
Mhm.
number of lives, quality of lives, length of lives,
What
right?
was the first thing you said?
Number, quality,
Mm,
length, right?
mhm.
Number,
Yep,
quality,
yep.
length. And,
Mhm,
there are sometimes trade-offs in
mhm.
those, right? And so you have to be, nuanced and that not everything has an easy answer. But if you sort of are guided by that, the main thing that's being damaged by the lockdowns is the quality of life.
Yeah.
There's also potentially some impact on the number of lives because people are more stressed. They're less likely to conceive kids. They're less likely to meet each other if they're young people. We're
Mm,
seeing that now in the continued descent of the fertility rates, right? The
yeah.
number of babies per women. And you're also potentially having an impact on the length of life because when people were locked down, they were eating less healthily, they were drinking more alcohol, they were not getting as much exercise or sunlight, they were not having the positive health supporting benefits of conversations with friends and, being able to see loved ones and whatnot. Those things are really important to our physical health.
A lot of that has persisted as well, so it's
Yes.
altered human behaviour, and I think for the
Yes.
developmentally sensitive, I mean, we're getting into
Totally.
costs now, but
Totally.
for groups in developmentally sensitive categories like children, adolescents, and first-year uni students, it's had
Yep.
it's a
Huge
permanent effect.
Huge impact. Well, it
Yeah.
certainly has a very long half-life, let's put it that way, right? There is bad habit formation, basically, right?
That's
And
right,
that
and
we've
we
also
stop
included in our book, but, you don't really know how like, what the half-life's gonna be and, we can't really put a dollar figure on it, but we did say, "Look, bad habit formation," this is another reason why our estimates were conservative, because we
Mhm,
didn't actually put a dollar figure on many intangible things like that or the
mhm,
lack of trust.
mhm,
Really
mhm.
had a loss of trust in governments and also in each other during this time. People have lost motivation. They've lost their social confidence because they were trained to just use screens all the time instead of really interacting with people. So you get students now, sometimes in first year uni, who I think are, they just have a panic attack just having a conversation with a professor because
Yeah.
it's in person and it's real and it's, oh my gosh, right? And they're just not used to it. They haven't had that kind of, I don't know, desensitization that you get if you have to interact with people every single day, which is what is the normal situation with humans. So that was the first big category, loss of life satisfaction. The second big category is the lost GDP and the debt.
Mhm.
So when you press pause on the economy, when you go into debt to finance the JobKeeper program and other similar programs that we did see, which again was to staunch the self-inflicted wounds of lockdowns,
Mhm.
that means that you're jeopardizing your ability to spend on everything else that makes life better for people. Yeah.
Mhm.
So we are always going to have a slightly worse situation compared to the counterfactual trajectory that we would have been on without that all that extra debt finance spending and lack of GDP. But we'll never see it. It's not in anybody's spreadsheet. It's just the counterfactual world that will never happen. And the difference between the levels of life satisfaction in that world and the levels that we now actually have, that is a cost of lockdowns. And so that cost is the second big component. That's another third or so of the amount of damage that is wrought by lockdowns. And
Mhm.
then the final third is a jumble of lots of other things. It's the crowded out healthcare, prevented cancer screenings, prevented cardio treatments. I myself have a gold tooth because of COVID. I couldn't get into the dentist for a couple years for a regular thing, and the filling expanded, broke the tooth, and it died. That sort of thing.
Mhm.
It's not much. I mean, it's just a tooth for me, but cost a root canal that might take, I don't know, a year off my life. I don't know, whatever. But there are costs like that, and
Yeah.
of course, the school closures for the children, as you mentioned, the acquisition of language for young children. I mean, my goodness, that's horrible.
Mhm.
The impact we've had on those children, and we've basically used the children as shields for the elderly, which is the
Yeah.
backwards way of doing it, right? I mean, aren't we supposed to?
Right.
Look, there were elder people during COVID who were trying to make their voice heard to say, please don't, subject my grandchildren to this. I lived and worked and sacrificed all my life to have them have a good life. And now we're saying that they should, be held back from school and not be able to play and not be able to see me because of my health. Let me die tomorrow. I want my grandchild to continue to live. That's the normal attitude, right? And we just
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
completely
We've
didn't.
reversed it.
Yeah, we reversed it and we didn't even ask people.
Mm.
Well, like you said, just imposing these conditions, these diktats from above without actually respecting the fact that people have a right to say what their position is or what their preferences are and to have those taken into consideration when any policy is set. And certainly when it comes to limitations on their freedom of movement, that should be sacred. That's not something that you mess with in a democracy, certainly. So we just completely abandoned so many principles on which, the West in general, but Australia particularly as well,
Place. Yeah.
were founded on. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, so though that was basically how we approached the cost benefit analysis. And then of course, what were the benefits? Well, we had to come up with some kind of counterfactual Australia in which we didn't have lockdowns, but everything else was as it was, right? And so
Mhm.
we had to reach overseas for some guidance on that. I didn't use a single simulation because I basically just didn't think they were worth the effort to do them during this time. And we saw all manner of simulations mislead people.
So let's say the modeling is part of the problem, isn't
No,
it? Yeah, yeah.
absolutely is part of the problem. We can get to that if you like. That's not science, by the way. That's dogma.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
can
yeah.
go
Yeah, let's
into it
get to that.
with
I think it's
a
interesting
model.
and disturbing that we're living by models. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I wanted to use, real data. So I went overseas to find sort of countries that had had low levels of restrictions and
Yeah.
looked at what their
Sweden.
COVID death counts were, and then, adjusted for population, a couple different options, tried to do it, as reasoned kind of back of the envelope guess as possible about what we would have achieved or, experienced if it
Mhm.
hadn't been for the lockdowns. And so then that estimate went in as the potential lives saved. And remember that, of course, most people who were dying of COVID were not young, right? The average
It's
age was
older than the average age of death.
exactly.
Mm.
So that means that the average COVID death was really only costing us, and I mean, every death is tragic, of course, but
Mm.
still, one has to recognize with this sort of cold analysis, an average COVID death meant the loss on average of maybe 3 to 5 high quality human life years at the most, at the
Mm.
outside, right?
Mhm.
Very different from the average death from, a childhood illness, let's say, or,
Mm.
having a kidney failure for an 18-year-old, right?
Not comparison.
happens, right? Yeah, I mean, you have to recognize the situation people in transplant teams are in, right? If you have a new heart come in and you've got a 20-year-old and a 75-year-old, who do you give the new heart to? Five, four, three, two, one.
20-year-old.
Okay, both die, right?
Yeah.
Try again. Five, four, three, 20-year-old, right? So you
Yeah.
just have to choose, and it's
Yeah.
not nice, and we don't want to, and I get it, and for ourselves and our family, of course, we would want to spend an infinite amount to keep anybody alive, of
Yeah.
course, but a society cannot sustain that. We
Well, you got
cannot.
in a lot of trouble for that on Q&A because I
I did it.
remember, yeah, I remember you saying, because I felt like, oh, thank God someone in the establishment, and you may not see yourself that way, but you're in the university, in a tenured job, was speaking up. And at that point, maybe there was Michael Leunig and Adam Creighton. I can't think of
Yep.
anybody else that had, a position in a sort of high profile institution or media. And you were really clear, but you went into this that you're talking about, this what is a life, and sometimes we have to make hard choices. And instead of hearing what you were saying in the abstract and balancing it in the way that politicians understand is necessary, and people at that level of the media, they deliberately kind of misrepresented it like you didn't care about human life. I thought
That's
you
right.
dealt with it very well, but you were trying to make an abstract conversation exactly of this kind. And yeah, they didn't take you up on your offer. In fact,
No, no, and I mean, you can see, and
yeah.
this happened on 60 Minutes as well, right?
Yeah.
There was definitely this
Oh, I haven't
railroading
seen you on
to,
that.
you're a granny killer, you don't care about old people, and, they can all just die according to you, and of course that's not true. I mean, obviously, but if you look at the collateral damage of our COVID policies, it mainly falls on the shoulders of the young people, and I care about them too, and, if I'm a policymaker, I have to think about the future of the country, and I have to think, well, I've only got scarce resources and this is a difficult crisis. I'm going to try to support the old people as best I can to stay alive, of course, but I'm particularly going to focus on the young people, the babies, the children. They are the future of our society. And throughout all of human history, we've put the children first. We've protected the children. We've protected the pregnant women. We don't even put women on the front lines a lot because we are the place where new life comes from, right? And so it's bizarre that there's this completely backwards argumentation and yeah, the pillorying of anybody who would try to make that argument as basically just wanting all old people to die, which is particularly poignant because my mother actually suffered from dementia for several years and then died in 2015, and I had to protect her from a neglectful husband who wanted to take over her affairs and would basically just have created a horrific life for her in the final few years. I had to defend against his court to be her legal guardian, his suit to be her legal guardian. And, I was doing this all from Australia. She was in Florida, and I'm, of course, the only child. And so I really fought hard to give her as long and as high quality a life as possible because I could see that there was a threat to her.
Not his father.
No, my
Okay,
father, the
right.
third husband of her, and narcissistic kind of guy who
Yeah.
he was able to keep under control in some sense in his narcissism when her mind was going. She's a very smart lady, but then as she started to slip into dementia, he just kind of became this monster, and I
Mhm.
could see it, and I had to take a lot of actions which were difficult in order to protect her.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so for me to be called granny killer is like it was laughable.
Yeah. Oh, it just showed that the media were beyond corrupt. The media failed in its duty categorically. I mean, that's part of why everyone was in fear because they confused that sort of death rate with the case rate. You know how that was always confused and the conflation of, died of and died with COVID. I mean, there was so much in that, but the media revealed itself like academia did, like the medical system did. In fact, like all of our institutions, the government itself. Like, democracy doesn't mean you need to have an MA in epidemiology. And it was almost as if that was the only grounds on which you could speak on anything. Even you as a professor of economics, what are your qualifications? But actually, we don't need qualifications to speak in a democracy. That's called politics. Everyone is entitled to speak in a democracy. And it was like there were all these inversions and revisions that happened overnight. And really, I mean, this is a whole other conversation, but have never been accounted for. I mean, that Royal Commission, all that revealed was what you told them in 2020. This will lead to a loss of trust. Yeah, now there's this radical loss of trust and a fracture, and our society has declined in its cohesion and its capacity. But yeah, I think the media demonstrated categorically that it had failed in its duty because, any dissident like you or critic was just caricatured. You were just caricatured.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they didn't know what they were doing. Maybe the person listening didn't understand that, but I believe the person interviewing you understood that you weren't a granny killer and that you weren't those things.
I don't know. I
You
really
don't
don't
know?
know. I mean, as it would be interesting because I mean, I have a lot of trouble putting myself in the position of somebody who is truly captured by the crowd.
Mm,
But I obviously had a lot of experience interacting with people who were captured by the crowd. And what my gut tells me about those people is that they really just did not have access to their normal sense making tools.
mm,
They simply had been hijacked. I mean, they'd been kidnapped. Their brains had been kidnapped. I remember
mm.
having a conversation briefly, very briefly, after one of the ABC Q&A episodes with someone. I might have been, oh, that union leader. I forget her name.
Yeah, I know the way you mean. I can't think of her name now with the short hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had, of course, been arguing for, the cost of lockdown should be considered and blah, blah, blah. And we were walking off off the stage, out of the studio, and she looked at me and she said something like, "I think I might be starting to understand what you mean," something like that. And, this is after I had been painstakingly trying to put the argument, for months up to that point, right?
Mm.
And she really seemed genuine. Like, I think she was Sally McManus.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
she
Yeah.
was I think it was Sally, somebody like that anyway. Um, I think she was I mean, she wasn't faking, right? It didn't seem to me like she was faking. Because
Mhm.
also, why would you then say that? If there's no reason to really make that private comment to me. Nobody else overheard it. It was
Mhm.
just sort of a personal comment. And so I honestly think a lot of people in the sort of mid ranks and, in the media or anywhere else genuinely believed at the time that they were doing the right thing. They were protecting society. They were protecting health. And this is what I talk about in that TEDx talk that was not
Mm.
approved.
The manipulator's playbook. Yeah, we can get to that.
Manipulator's
Yeah.
playbook. Yeah, I mean, it's basically people truly were captured by this ideology, by this propaganda, and they were dispossessed of their ability to think. And
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
like,
look, I fully agree with you on that. And I argued that in my UK column piece about paradigm war.
yeah,
However, as perhaps in two ASF forums ago, we talked about the difference between your personal life and political leaders.
yeah,
I agree with you that they were captured, but I believe that they ought to be accountable. I'm sure you do too. But I
oh
mean,
yeah,
to me, the fact that these talking heads in the media and decision makers in government were captured and there's been no accounting when people suicided, lost their jobs, have been so radically impacted. I mean, a whole group of us became a scapegoat class. I couldn't have imagined in my lifetime that I would become a scapegoat class
yeah,
and genuinely fear for the implications of that. I had a friend who had a nightmare that she was held down and forcibly vaccinated. And this is a woman with a PhD. It's like it was brutal.
yeah,
And there's been no accounting for that. So while I agree with you that they were captured and they were caught in genuine fear and genuine groupthink and genuine beliefs, I mean, to me, there's even been a paradigm distinction because most of them still believe it. And in
yeah,
fact, it's a kind of underlying technocratic worldview where they want to feel safe above having liberty. I think they traded liberty for safety.
yes,
And those of us over here on Team Human don't want to do that. So my feeling is that we've separated. We're like two land masses now.
yeah.
But at the time when this happened, I believe that they were that they weren't performing their duties and they ought to be accountable to us because of the consequences
No,
that
I
are now,
totally
now
agree.
visible.
I
Yeah,
totally agree. I mean, I don't hold out a lot of hope that we will get full justice.
me neither.
But just because I'm a student of history, right? But I
Yeah.
do very much hope that we will get at least a few, trials of people who were culpable for taking the wrong decisions, not following protocol, making up excuses for why that protocol didn't apply, whether it was the pandemic management policies that were in place before March 2020, whether it was the testing of these novel gene therapy products, or whether it was whatever else. Whatever protocols were in place that they didn't follow, I think that's one way to get them. I mean, there's lots of different legal minds now, thank goodness, who are working on this problem of how best to put the argument and how to frame it such that it's really crystal clear that someone did the wrong thing.
Mm,
If they were told, such and such from the experts, and these people thought that we should go ahead. They still had an obligation to the people they were serving to actually follow the procedures and protocols that were the distillation of decades of public health knowledge and understanding about how to run institutions,
mm.
whether health institution or anything else. And so that was all just sort of run roughshod over. And so I think there's got to be ways that we can get a few of them. I've said years ago, I said I thought that the Pfizer's execs, the CEO of Pfizer, some of the top brass would probably serve jail time. I still think that that's probably likely.
Alfred Bull, I think his name is, or yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yeah, and possibly Moderna. I'm not sure. But there will be some people who pay. I think. I
Mm,
certainly hope, and I hope there's a decent number. But the way to move forward is not to be despairing about the fact that, when there's a crowd dynamic, so many people lose their minds, and then we just can't rely on them making good decisions. But rather to try to think about the kinds of reforms to our institutions that prevent the takeover of nonsense ideologies when they arise. And fear is one of the big catalysts for the takeover of nonsense ideologies, right?
yeah.
Fear, and in fact, funnily enough, I think loss of control. When
Mm,
people are given enough independent agency over what they should have agency over, their lives, their decisions about their children, decisions about their own profession, making choices for themselves and their families, they there's sort of a deep angst and a deep frustration that kind of starts to fester, and that can boil over into a vulnerability to nonsense ideology. And then sometimes people can subscribe to that, and they just start going into their echo chamber, and they just become more and more attuned to that, more radicalized, you might say.
yeah.
I think empowerment of people and recognition, that sort of libertarian mindset. I mean, I don't call myself a libertarian. I don't call myself much. That's a label, but I do have a lot of sympathy for the mindset that people should be the ones making the decisions about their lives. And we
Mm,
live in a democracy, and that means voicing their preferences about how their tax dollars are spent and how their government runs the country. And if you don't do that, you create the seeds of dysfunction in
mm,
various ways. So that's the thing, and the fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. What is it? FDR said that, I think, and that's just true. And the government did the opposite during COVID. Our government hired actresses to pretend like they were dying, and the 35-year-old girls or whatever women who were in hospitals supposedly unable to breathe, and it's just completely
I know it was a TAC commercial without admitting it, wasn't it? I mean, it was a yeah, yeah, it was propaganda, pure propaganda, and they ought to be held accountable. I agree with you though that it's unlikely that they're going to, and my sense is it'll be like the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse, like the Catholic priests are held accountable when they're 90 or dead, and I worry that that's where it's going to go because all the cases seem to fall over. And my intuition, it's not a sort of particularly learned point of view, but just my sense is that it's because there's too many people implicated. It's so
Well, that's a huge problem.
full,
Yes.
full of threads through the whole culture
Yeah.
where most of the leaders of the institutions, up to and including former prime ministers, are accountable. And so because of that, I see it as not happening until those people are either so old or passed away, like we see with other historical grievances.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's very likely. I mean, I think one of the historical analogies that I like to think of is I don't like to think of it, but that I think is apt is the post-Nazi period in Germany. So what happened then? Because again, there you had this kind of capture by this ideology, which was
Mm.
a nonsense ideology, right? We need to eliminate these people, right, in order for the greater good of the fatherland or something. And what happened to those people afterwards? What happened to the regular German people who kind of went along with stuff, maybe didn't know the full horrors, but went along with it, right? Did they ever face the truth? What exactly, and how'd that go? I think that's an area we can really learn from a period in history in terms of what to expect and how to treat the people who emerge from that cocoon, right? And face the music, want to face the music at least. Some of the people just on the street, not people who are making decisions, but who were kind of in some way, at least didn't stand up to what was happening. Maybe they weren't totally complicit, but they didn't really resist it. To actually face that what they went along with was massively disruptive to their society, to their children, to their parents, to themselves. That's a huge psychological hit for most people because most people want to
Well,
think of
that's my grandparents, although I didn't get to talk to them, that they were adults, young adults in the Nazi regime.
okay,
And I think the threat of violence, like my sort of by osmosis through family law understanding, is the threat of violence was so great that opposition meant you were, basically killed. But there was also a sense in which, yeah, there was genuine belief in it too. And I think that the whole nation has been beset by shame and trauma as a result, and the trauma of what happened after too, that isn't part of the popular imagination or understanding either. I mean,
yeah,
it's massive bombings and rapes of German women,
definitely,
Yeah, I just think there's intergenerational trauma.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely true, and I think this honestly, the scale of this disaster is even bigger. I hate
I
to
do
say
too, because it's global. It's the
it's
first
global.
time
Yep.
that every single place, I mean, there was some variation, but pretty much that's the whole point of lockstep, as they called it. Everybody's the same. And yeah, and I mean, the denial around it is extraordinary. And so, if you go on Substack or you go into the kind of media that we would be on, where you're looking at COVID contrarian points of view, everyone's still talking about it and processing it and distressed about it and angry about it. And over here, it's like it never happened. It's like
I
it didn't even
know,
exist. And it's like,
I know.
let's move on. And there's an argument to let's move on, but not from a place where you gaslight the dissidents and pretend it never happened. We move on
Exactly.
from a place of recognition
Yeah,
and even, I think, apology and possibly compensation.
absolutely,
Uh,
totally, and I think also the other reason why the scale is so huge is because of the vaccine story, right? So there
yeah.
wasn't something like that, no comparable to that in the case of the Second World War. So, I mean, we did have a lot of the German troops exposed to methamphetamines and drugs to keep them going. That probably had some serious repercussions on their health later on, right? That's probably true, but the number of people exposed was so much smaller
Mm,
than the number of people who've been exposed now to this, COVID vaccine stuff. And if you look at the best estimates, I'm actually working on a blog right now with my co-authors on my first COVID book, The Great COVID Panic,
mhm.
on trying to get a rough handle on what's the maximum badness that we could expect from these COVID vaccines in terms of human death.
So this
Right.
Paul Freitas and
Alternatives
Michael
and
Baker.
Michael Baker. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we've done a series of blogs for Brownstone. So our first book, The Great COVID Panic, was actually Brownstone Institute's first book.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
it kind of
I
kicked
didn't
off
know it
the
was this
institute.
book. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So I sent the manuscript to Jeffrey Tucker in May 2021, and he, at the time, I didn't know it. He'd left the American Institute for Economic Research, and
Mhm.
where he'd been blogging, positive, like sane stuff about COVID, which is why I
Mhm.
sent the manuscript because we sort of sent it around to a few people just to get their views before we.
So is Jeffrey an economist? I thought he was a journalist.
No, he's not really either. He's sort of got a mixed background. He's a very sensible guy, very
Yeah. Oh, he's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, very smart, very, very libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, or what they call it,
Anarcho-capitalist.
anarcho-capitalist, yeah,
Okay.
that
Yeah.
sort of really extreme libertarian.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
Very lovely man, though. I mean, if you've met him, right? He's lovely.
Yeah.
So Brownstone didn't exist when I sent him this manuscript, and he apparently stayed up all night reading it, and then sent me a message saying, "Look, who's publishing this book?" And then 10 minutes later, no, 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 let me rephrase. I must publish this book. It's never been like, okay, you in what army, Jeffrey? Right? Because AEIR didn't have a publishing arm that would take it, as far as I could tell. And our plan had been to just self-publish using some, fly-by-night printer in Thailand or something. And anyway, we embarked on an 8-week back and forth. Oh, will we not? We hope so. We hope it'll work. Finally, Jeffrey said he'd gotten a check big enough from somebody to be able to make the publication happen. We sent him the final manuscript 1st of August, and then it came out 1st of September as Brownstone's founding book. So that sort of ignited our collaboration, obviously, with Brownstone, a nascent think tank. And we now have a series of blogs that Paul and Michael and I have written for Brownstone.
I've read a couple of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Probably, I don't know, 3 dozen or so, I would imagine, or so, 3, 4 dozen, about lots of things, expanding on some of the stuff we talked about in the Great COVID Panic, commenting on other kinds of social, phenomena that we're seeing, or going into more detail about particular aspects. And a lot of those then we've been republishing on Australians for Science and Freedom's website. So, we have a blog site on ASF.
Yeah.
Republish
Yeah.
from a lot of different places, Spectator, Colette, lots of other, the Australian sometimes. Anyway, so that one of the blogs that we are working on right now is this, trying to get an estimate, and the estimate looks pretty bleak, I have to say. I mean, this looks worse than Great Leap Forward by, you know, at least a few times. And certainly worse than the Second World War or any of the other little blips, basically. I mean,
So are you talking about death or miscarriages or
death and prevented life. Yeah, it's two main categories. There's the excess deaths, and
yeah.
then there's the prevented lives. So
Right.
the excess
Yeah.
deaths
Yeah.
are, people who would die who wouldn't have otherwise died. The prevented lives, people who wouldn't have been, who are not going to be conceived or carried to term because of the damage from the shots. So, the reasons for not being conceived might include, for example, that your would-be mother and father don't meet, or your mother can't carry you to term because she miscarries because of damage from the shots.
And have you gone into the science of that? Because again, that's highly contested out there in normie land. I
No.
mean, where we sit, there's a lot of research emerging. But there's this bizarre world where research no longer crosses the paradigm divide either.
Yeah, I know. Well, and it's interesting because very few, I don't think anybody has actually come out in the medical sphere and tried to pin the tail on the donkey. Give me an estimate. How bad could it be? And we feel like we've got the ability to do that. We have a platform to do that. And we're economists. So in some sense, it's easier professionally for us to do it. We're doing it just on the basis, not really of medical science, but just looking at the numbers that have come in so far on
Mhm.
excess deaths and world births, fertility
Sure.
rates and stuff, and just sort of connecting the dots, looking at some of the other estimates out there, trying to line up to what's going on. So you can read it when it comes out. It'll probably be out in
Yeah,
a
yeah,
week.
I'm interested.
Um,
Yeah, because it's an estimate rather than I can't think of his name now, but there was a an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked a bit. I heard him on Naomi Wolf's Daily Clout.
James Thorpe.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he was identifying that pretty early on,
Oh yeah,
much
well,
higher
Chris,
miscarriage rates in his practice.
exactly. And the thing is, it's useful. We think it's useful to try to bound it so that people can at least, instead of just sort of thinking, "Oh my gosh, the entire world is going to be destroyed."
Mhm.
Okay, how bad really are we talking, right? What like how bad? What's the order of magnitude that we are dealing with here?
Mhm.
And then what are the possibilities? What are the uncertainties? Fine, we can kind of continue to monitor those, but just to enable there to be a little bit more of a scientific and grounded conversation about it, than people being afraid to say anything and just saying, "Oh my gosh, all the babies are going to be deformed," right? And it scares people, and we don't want to scare people. We want people to have some mastery over it. We want to give them a framework to think about how bad could this be, and then we will keep revisiting that, and we'll see how it goes. But at the moment, it definitely looks like there's a possibility that it could be the worst ever human disaster.
Well, many of us were saying that at the time. I remember saying I'm part of the control group.
I
Um,
know, me too. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So what I mean, if we can jump ahead and maybe you don't want to do this until you've published it, but what are you saying is the uh, estimate in terms of lives lost and consequences, I guess, for the human population?
Well, if you just count the excess deaths and the prevented births to date, well, actually just through 2023, because that's the latest data we've got,
Mhm.
you're talking about something around 50 million maximum.
Mhm.
If you then include the possible future damage, it could be many times multiple of that.
Yeah, yeah. You mean in terms of the 50 million and their potential descendants?
Not just those, the 50 million are the ones that have been lost, but
Yeah.
it's the continuing damage in those who continue to live, but
Oh,
are
okay.
vaccinated. And then extra deaths and extra non-births because of the damage that's been done to those people, to the people who are still living. Yeah.
Gee, this will be really important research for the dissident movement to hold politicians accountable. I
Yeah,
mean,
I mean, as I said this, I've been saying that for years. The notion of burden of proof is an interesting one to consider here because there's often been this hostility from the mainstream that says, well, you haven't proven that these products have caused this much death or caused these problems or whatever, right? So who are you? Now, my feeling is that actually, the burden of proof should be on the inventors, distributors, approvers, and otherwise pushers of poorly tested, novel, poorly tested products that we don't have any long term data on, and that in history have only been given to people who were very close to death anyway, because it was kind of suspected that they'd have pretty bad side effects. Right. So it's the burden of proof
in
should,
the M
should rest on the shoulders of those pushing this new technology rather than the burden of proof to say that they're safe or otherwise resting on the shoulders of people who are a little resistant to them. Right.
It's another reversal, isn't it? Because it used to
Another
work that
reversal.
way. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So we're putting this up as our best guess. Of course there's a billion assumptions that go into it. And we could be wrong on any number of them, but we want to at least start the conversation in a holistic sense. Overall, looking at all of these different pathways and effects and this, that, and the other, what's our best guess
Mhm.
at the moment? And then we just keep revising it. Sort of like the lockdown book that you held up before. It's
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
I'm sure it's not perfectly accurate, right? I hope that somebody, maybe some PhD students eventually will, maybe a series of them will take that work and update it as new data are coming in about the harms of lockdowns as actually revealed in real data. But it was our best guess at the time, and it started the conversation.
That's I mean, that's the scientific method, isn't it, Gigi? It's not follow the science. It's like yeah, explore a hypothesis and come up with data. And that data might be later revised or falsified, or, I mean, that's the process.
That's the
Yeah,
process.
yeah. I wanted to sort of shift gears a little bit and ask you also about, because we talked about the consequences before, and if we can just bring it down to two, because I know that there's lots, like there's education and so on. You talked about mental health. Also about the economy, like what's going on with inflation? Can we link this back to the lockdowns? Some people say it's more about the wars. Can you talk about that? I mean, just for the average layperson,
Yeah, sure.
because we've had
I
this massive, we're talking about Heinz tomato sauce. Well, it's kind of tripled in price, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I remember being in a seminar in, I think it was like late 2021 or early 2022, where it was an RBA seminar, Reserve Bank of Australia,
Hmm.
online, of course, because we couldn't meet in person. And somebody gave a talk, about the very, very low inflation rate at the time, or very, very low cash rate at the time. And I asked a question, which was, well, we've been pushing pause on the economy while injecting all this money into the economy. That sort of sounds to me like the ingredients for stagflation. Is anybody worried about stagflation? Because I remember hearing about stagflation when I was a little girl. In fact, it was during the stagflationary period of the mid 70s that my grandmother purchased 3 zero coupon bonds at ridiculously high interest rates. And that's the only reason that I was able to afford to go to Yale. Because by the time I then was born and reached the age of going to university, those bonds had significantly appreciated in
Yeah,
value,
yeah,
as you
yeah.
can imagine. And so my parents and my grandmother gave it to my parents to enable me to attend Yale for 3 terms, three years. And then I had to accelerate by a term. And then the last term, I got sponsored by the Department of Defense to go study in Russia for half a year. So,
It's a story.
yeah, there's another story. I have lots of stories. Anyway, but that sort of, I guess, recognition just it got laughed out of the room. I mean, people thought on that seminar, they're like, stagflation. Oh, come on. Yeah, no, we are very confident that this low cash rate will be appropriate. We will not have inflation, blah, blah. And of course, then I think it must have been late 2021 because after that, then the inflation started and we saw the rise in prices in energy before Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw the rise in
Oh, okay, yeah.
prices of food before Russia invaded Ukraine. We were seeing price rises. We did a blog on this actually, again,
Mhm.
someplace on Milestone, I think.
I'll link it
Uh,
in the show notes when I put this up. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And anyway, so if I were to give you my honest opinion on whether or not the lockdown policies or just generally the COVID policies had anything to do with inflation, I'd say yes, absolutely they did.
Yeah.
And not only in terms of just the monetary side, but also the real side, because when we put the economy into pause, we disrupt trade links. And that was honestly the first thing that went through my head when we started these lockdowns. I thought, and it's because of my study of Russia. I spoke some Russian when I was younger, and I studied Gorbachev's Perestroika when I was in as my honor, my sort of senior thesis at university, and so I was very familiar with what happened at the end of the USSR's reign.
Mm.
And what happened was 6 years of declining GDP and suffering humans is what happened until finally they recovered enough to be able to sort of mount a regular economy again, right? And
Mhm.
and so you saw primitivization, you saw people basically whose trade links were annihilated in one stroke when the Soviet Union went out of business. Because previously it was the center telling people what to produce and whom to trade with. When the center collapsed, there's no more instructions about that. And so all these individual factories that were left hanging around with all these bosses and people and everything and machinery, they had to figure out what were they going to make and who were they going to sell it to? Who are they going to employ?
And didn't the oligarchs sweep in and buy that stuff up like happens
Sure.
in
Yes.
in the US as well? Yeah.
100%. But they still needed to work out what to do with it, right?
Yeah.
Once you have it, that's fine, but you still got to work out what to do. So that the process of forming new links, new trade networks cost them several years. It just takes a long time. So when we started going to lockdowns, that was the first thing that went through my head. It wasn't even the just deprivation of human liberties. I mean, I was worried about that, but as an economist, my first thought was, oh no, they're going to destroy the trade links and we're going to be unable to just have them bounce back. Because I mean, the lockdowns during the lockdowns, I always had the impression that the politicians thought that the business people of this world would just kind of stay in suspended animation, and
Yeah.
locked down. Oh, uh-huh. Yeah, and then as soon as the politicians say go, they're okay. I'll just work again. That's not how it works,
Yeah,
right?
well, it's not how life works either, does it?
Of
Yeah,
course
yeah.
not. You get
Yeah.
on with life, you find
Yeah.
out something
Yeah.
better. And we saw the great exodus. We saw from the labor market in the US, we saw a lot of people changing sectors. We saw a lot of businesses going out of business and their owners going into some other business. We saw lots of change arounds basically. And some of
Yeah.
it was positive, but a lot of it was not what would have been chosen.
Well, you talked about in this book, I remember you saying people who wouldn't have retired, people lost their businesses who wouldn't have, and then their employees
Yeah.
went, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so
All
all
that.
of that has contributed to inflation then.
All that, all
So,
it contributed not just to inflation, but it contributed to making prices higher, right? Because yeah,
yeah.
real prices, not just, there's more money around for fewer services and goods, and so you end up having a higher price per good or service. It's also that literally it became more expensive to deliver any product to any person in the economy because the trade networks were disrupted, and so those just cost more to get something shipped on an international container or shipped across the country. The energy prices were higher, so it cost more to fuel the truck and all that sort of stuff. So real prices went up, and there was this monetary injection, which also caused inflation. So yes, I think that if I had to pin the tail on the donkey of what was the primary cause of the inflation, yeah, the lockdown policies and associated COVID policies. Now, it doesn't hurt, to also consider other factors. Always, there's never just one thing going on, and certainly in the last few years, we have seen some, other reasons for increased prices. Certainly the war in Ukraine is one of them. And perhaps now the tariffs and whatnot, right, are causing disruption and uncertainty. And so that's probably also fueling a bit of this. But if you look at the timing of the inflation, I think actually is a bit of an interesting kind of lesson in how long does it take for actions to propagate through the economy, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
or lack of action in the case of the RBA, because poor old Philip Lowe didn't raise the cash rates until it was kind of too late, and inflation was already kind of out the gates, right? And so you see that it took, X number of quarters before you really saw those prices start to go up. And then they've come down with a lag after the cash rates have been, raised, and then they start coming down. So it's a classic fool in the shower illustration, right? You change, if you're the RBA, you change the cash rate. You think you're changing it to be, let's say, warmer, but you're still feeling the cold. So you're still, turn a little bit warmer. Then you're still feeling it just tepid.
Allergy.
And then you eventually get, burned and then you have to turn
Yeah.
back. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Why do you think there's no conversation about this? I mean, I've got some ideas, but
People
we
want
just
to
not.
forget about COVID. They do
Yeah.
not want to talk about it. I mean,
Yeah.
a very
Or its
prominent
impact.
economist whose name I won't give you,
Oh, go
actually said,
on, name names.
no, I can't, well, she'd
Right.
be very upset.
Oh,
Um,
she. Okay.
yeah, yeah. But mainstream lady, very,
Mhm.
very top of her game. She said something like, "Oh, these people who just will bring up COVID policy even when it's not relevant, including during, conversations about cost of living." So we have this cost of living big dialogue coming up in Sydney, and yeah, Cameron Murray is moderator. Adam Crichton is on the panel,
Mhm.
also Jennifer Westacott and Alison Preston. Now, Adam and Cameron and I were outspoken against COVID
Yeah,
policies.
you're
All of
right.
these people in this event are, they are always talking about COVID, even when it's not relevant, including cost of living. And it's like, lady, sorry. It is relevant. The fact that you don't want to talk about it is another issue. We can talk about that later, but don't tell me not to talk about something that is, clearly an originating force. Now, of course, we are now several years after the lockdowns and a lot of disruption has already worked its way through the system. And so it's not, I mean, at the moment we can't say, well, change COVID policy and that'll change inflation, right? We're living this world now.
Yeah, this is the downstream effect. But I hear you saying there's a multiplicity of effects, yeah?
Absolutely.
But that's
Absolutely.
the
And so we have,
primary one. Yeah?
that's the
Or
primary one, and put
yeah.
into motion many other ones that are still playing out. So, for example, the reduction in competition levels,
Mhm.
because a lot of mom and pop businesses went out of business during
Yeah.
the COVID era because they couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford all the restrictions. They couldn't afford the disruption, et cetera. They have smaller profit margins. That means that then consumer welfare in expectation falls because competition is good for consumer welfare. Competition means you have choice. It means you have, the ability to hold whoever it is you're going to buy something from to account to make sure that thing is as low priced and high quality as possible because you have an alternative. If you
Mm,
don't have an alternative to buy from, you just gotta wear it. You just gotta buy
mhm,
from the person
mhm,
who's gonna charge you more and give you a worse product. That's why competition is good for
mm,
people.
mm.
So that by itself means that you're gonna have higher prices because if you have less competition, those who are monopolists or oligopolists who are enjoying market power can charge a higher price. That's just the case.
And then you also wipe out a whole class of people who can say no because they're independent, because they're not employees who get
Yep.
mandated or lose their job. I
Yep.
mean, that's the other thing. I just feel like it really wiped out a class of people that can hold the line.
Totally. Totally. I mean, the amount of economic stress and consequences, for people's families, being able to feed people's families. I know multiple people who got the shot because they just needed to feed their families and they didn't see another way, right?
Me
And
too. And they feel utterly violated by the
oh,
state. And there's no
totally.
discussion about
It
how
is
violated.
violation. It's
Yeah.
absolutely physical
Ab
violation, right?
absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
just awful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm hoping that some of that stuff comes up, but I also want the conversation on Monday, the 7th of July, to be focused on solutions, on things we can do now, because that's where we have to be focused as a movement now.
Yeah.
I feel like nobody else is going to be in that space. A lot of people are still wanting to talk about what happened, and I think it's important to come to terms with that. And I definitely support all of that. But I think there's a scarcity of voices really taking seriously the need to rebuild and reform
Mhm.
institutions to try to prevent this happening again. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I
the
agree.
primary focus I have for ASF, for Australians for Science and Freedom, and in my own writing, and certainly at the event on Monday, we'll talk about where it came from, but the second half of the conversation is gonna be what can we do about it?
Mhm, mhm. So tell us about this conference. It's got 3 COVID contrarians, but 3 mainstream people, has it? Because
Well
that's the other thing, we're all siloed now and then just talking to the converted. So that's kinda good if you're on a mainstream platform.
well, this is the great thing about this organization. So ASF is partnering with this organization called the Brisbane Dialogues or Australian Dialogue,
Yep.
and they were founded, I think, about 7 or 8 years ago with a mission to elevate the quality of public discourse about big issues in
Okay.
Australian society.
Yep.
So social issues, economic issues, political issues, whatever. And they've had a number of big dialogues, they call them, across Australia, different, mostly in Brisbane, but some in Melbourne, Canberra. This will be the first one in Sydney, on issues ranging from Indigenous affairs to energy to universal basic income. I was actually a panelist on the UBI one, and I was also a panelist on the one about how should we manage the next pandemic. That was what it was called. That was,
Mhm,
I think, in 2022. That's still the only public discussion across the aisles that I know of that was actually reasonably respectful,
mhm.
kind of balanced, and we really did have people with very, very differing views on the stage.
Well, enough
And
years have
yeah,
passed. Yeah,
this is
in the height of it, I think the groupthink meant it was just anathema to the mainstream point of view. Whereas I've noticed now there's much more willingness to listen to the dissident voice than there
yes.
was then. They were incapable then without demonizing us. Whereas now there's a capacity to hear that.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's
Mhm.
true. I mean, the cost of living one is not obviously focused directly on COVID, but we wanted
Yeah.
to get a variety of views. And so we've got, yeah, Jennifer Westacott is the chancellor or vice chancellor of Western Sydney University.
Mhm.
And Alison Preston is a professor of economics at University of Western Australia.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we don't know exactly what they're going to say. We're not going to control what they say, but they definitely have more mainstream views, I would say, than Adam Crichton, who's the third panelist, and probably going to argue for kind of smaller government and probably some issues with COVID or whatnot. Cameron Murray's the moderator, so he'll be balancing the views and sort of, and I'm just the MC, so I don't get to have an opinion.
Oh, you're not speaking. Oh,
So,
that's a shame. Oh,
well,
there's a theatrical piece coming in.
Well, I can play a lot of roles in performing arts. I mean, I had a lot of different roles when I was in high school and college, pretty much everything from, dancing, singing, acting, stage managing, directing,
You're a
movie
triple
directing.
threat.
I was doing everything. So I basically am comfortable in any role. And I think for this particularly, I don't want to be seen to be the one who is, because I instigated this. I was the one who said we should have this. And I asked the Economic Society of Australia, that's having its annual Australian Conference of Economists at that time in the Sydney Masonic Centre. I said, look, you don't have anything scheduled for Monday night. Can we use the space, Sydney Masonic Centre, to have a big dialogue on cost of living? And they said yes. And so that's what kicked the whole thing off. Then I reached out to Murray Hancock, and everything has gone from there.
Part of the economics conference, it's in parallel, but it'll mean you'll attract some of that audience, yeah?
Exactly. It's not part of the conference, but it's separately ticketed, but it's available basically as
Yeah,
a,
yeah.
and we do give conference attendees a discount.
Mhm.
And also ASF members get a discount on ticket. So, I think it'll be a very, it's always a very respectful and very nuanced, interesting conversation about the various
Yeah.
different causes of cost of living problem. And then, as I say, focusing on solutions. So that's the next ASF event. And then we also have, just to give a plug for this, we also have a screening on the 10th of September at Fox Studios in Moore Park of the collateral film called, the new documentary film called COVID Collateral, which
Mhm.
is of Canada. And we're going to build it, or have built it, as a bring a friend opportunity. So basically, the film is very tame by kind of our standards, I suppose, but it
Mhm.
features a lot of people we'll know, Jay Bhattacharya and Scott Atlas. And it's just very gentle as an introduction to an alternative way of thinking about what happened during COVID. So just like you were saying before, people are now a little more open to hearing from maybe somebody who has a dissident view about COVID. This is an opportunity to take along a person from your friend group or from your family who might be just questioning a little bit and have a
Mhm.
time come to the film, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards, Q&A session with some of the people who actually did experience the kind of cancellation and denigration that is highlighted in that movie. So I'm hoping Roz Nealon Cook will come along and participate. She's a psychologist who got
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah,
deregistered, right, because
yeah,
of
yeah.
speaking out about the harms to children of school closures. I'll probably be on that panel, and then we'll probably get one or two other people to be on the panel and to moderate. So yeah, that should be a really fun experience too. And then of course we have our annual conference in November, November 21 to 23, at UNSW this year, as it was the first year we did our conference in 2023.
Mhm.
So that's something to put in the diary, and we have a very exciting program of many different exciting sessions and speakers lined up for that. So people should
Mhm.
definitely diarize it.
That's excellent. And I really like the way you're entering into some of the more mainstream places and having that conversation because we need to have it there too, don't we?
Yep.
Otherwise, we become the silo. I love the ASF conference and I love the Brownstone. It was really special. But I think what you're trying to do here with the economics conference and the film, it's quite important because that's what's been ruptured, including right down to personal relationships. And
Totally.
it's one of the many costs, I think, and it's possibly the deepest cost.
Yep.
And maybe that's a good note to end it on because, of course, in your work, you talk a lot about the mobilization of love and fear, like a pro social and in some ways an anti-social hijack that happens to support this groupthink. But you said somewhere that your mum asked you when you were eight, what's the meaning of life? And you said,
To make other people happy, of
to
course.
make other people happy. Yeah. And I was quite moved by that and touched by it. And I think, in a sense, you're saying there's this conversation we need to have about what the costs are and what it meant. And we can't have it alone with those of us who already hold that view. We need to have it with, our friends
Right.
and family and everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we have to
So,
rediscover that, and it's a very difficult
so you,
challenge. I mean, fortunately, we don't have to invent something. We just have to restore what we used to have. It used to be possible to speak across the aisles, to have conversations with people who had very, very different beliefs than you do about, important issues from, ranging from health policy to, gun rights or, what greenhouse or whatever, all sorts of different really big issues that people, often kind of identify with. They really associate, they bind to their own ego, to their own psychology. And we still used to be able to converse. And we used to see the common humanity in people on the other side. And
mm,
now I think there's this cultural pressure to dehumanize and just kind of straw man the anybody with an alternative view. And the reality is that are very unlikely, any person out there is very unlikely to share every single belief that you hold.
mm,
It's just very unlikely, right? People believe all sorts of weird nonsense, right? And just crazy stuff. And some probably some of the things I believe, some people would think are nuts, right? Like my hope for the future and my belief in the power of people to collaborate and make things better, and that the best ideas will win out and all this. I mean, I look at history and I see that. Some people look at history and what they see is destruction and exploitation and power abuse and, decline, right? I don't see that. I mean, I
mm,
see some of those things, but I don't think that that's the theme, or that's the general secular trend that we are on. I've seen increasing human life quality over
mm.
the, many generations.
That's kind of Steven Pinker's thesis, isn't it? But I think it's complicated, isn't it? Because with all of those benefits, like say of modernity or hygiene, or, we have these complicated shadows and deficits like the loss of human connection but we need to have the conversation and we're not having it. I mean, I'm concerned and possibly a little bit sit in a place of a little bit more cynical is not the right word, but worried or something insofar as I think the paradigm break means that some of those positions are irreconcilable. But I
Mm,
don't think that should mean we can't have the conversation or that we shouldn't. But I do suspect that the technocratic view is incompatible with the team human view. They're just really, sketchy versions of the two camps. And I think there's many internal camps, but the internet makes that difficult. But I don't think that means we shouldn't keep trying. And
yeah,
the fact that you're doing that and you're actually doing it in a practical way, not just paying lip service to it.
yeah,
So that's really important. Yeah.
yeah. No, you may be right, but I think we all need to have the humility to recognize that we don't know what the outcome of a real conversation between those two sides, or any two sides, would be.
I
Oftentimes,
agree.
when you have a really open, respectful conversation, you end up realizing that you actually share some things in common that you didn't realize initially. That's certainly the goal of the big dialogues, to end up on a common ground. And I
Mm.
certainly hope that'll happen this July. And I certainly hope eventually, with respect to COVID policy, we land on some common ground from which we can all move forward and build a better Australia for our kids.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good note to end it on, Gigi. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for
Yeah,
having
and
me.
I look forward
Great.
to seeing you at the conferences and, yeah, different
That'd be
things.
great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. I'll finish up now. Thanks, Gigi. I'm happy to have a little debrief if you want. I'll just stop.